And welcome back. We're live at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, continuing our 360 Town Hall conversation with President Barack Obama. Guns in America, talking to voices from all sides of the issue, including the president. You made your announcement just the other day in a very obviously emotional ceremony at the White House. And I want to play just a moment from it for those who haven't seen it.
And from first graders in Newtown. First graders. And from every family who never imagined that their loved one would be taken from our lives by a bullet from a gun. Every time I think about those kids, it gets me mad.
I think a lot of people were surprised by that moment.
I was too, actually. You know, I visited Newtown 2 days after what happened, so it was still very raw. It's the only time I've ever seen Secret Service cry on duty. And it wasn't just the parents. You had siblings, you know, 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 3-year-olds, who in some cases didn't even understand that their brother or sister weren't going to be coming home. And I've said this before, it continues to haunt me. It was one of the worst days of my presidency. But look, I want to emphasize that there are a lot of tragedies that happen out there as a consequence of the victims of crime. You know, there are police officers who are out there laying down their lives to protect us every single day. You know, and tears are appropriate for them as well, and I visit with those families as well, victims of terrorism, soldiers coming home. You know, there's a lot of heartache out there, and I don't suggest that this is the only kind of heartache we should be working on. You know, I spend a lot of time and a lot of hours, in fact, a lot more hours than I spend on this, trying to prevent terrorist attacks. I spend a lot of time and a lot of hours trying to make sure that we're continuing to reduce our crime rate. There are a whole bunch of other answers that are just as important when it comes to making sure that the streets of places like Chicago and Baltimore are safer. Making sure kids get a good early childhood education. Making sure that we're teaching conflict resolution that doesn't involve violence. Making sure that you know, faith communities are able to reach out to young people and intervene in timely ways. So this is not a recipe for solving every problem. Again, I just want to emphasize that the goal here is just to make progress. And it's interesting, as I enter into my last year as president, I could not be prouder of the work that we've done, but it also makes you really humble, because you realize that change takes a long time, and a lot of the work you do is just to incrementally make things better, so that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the crime rate has gone down. That's not just because of my administration. That's the groundwork was laid by a bunch of good work by law enforcement and others for years across administrations on a bipartisan basis. The same is true with traffic safety. The same is true with advances in medicine. The same can be true with this if we stop exaggerating or mischaracterizing the positions of either side, and we just come up with some sensible areas that people agree with. Background checks are an example. The majority of gun owners agree with this.
You talk about faith communities. Father Michael Pfleger is here. I know you know him well. He's a Roman Catholic priest in Chicago. For those who don't know, his church is St. Sabina on the south side of Chicago. I was there about a month ago. It was a great honor to be there. Father, you've given a lot of eulogies for a lot of kids in your community, far too many over the 40 years that you have been there. What's your question for the president?
Mr. President, first of all, thank you. Thank you for your courage and your passion, and keep pushing. I happen to be from one of those cities where violence is not going down. Not only, as Anderson mentioned, the 55 shot, there's been 11 killed in 7 days in Chicago. One of the main reasons for that is the easy access to guns. It's easier to get a gun in my neighborhood than it is a computer. And the reality is because many of those guns have been bought legally. And I understand why people are pushing against you, because they understand it's a business and it's about a business. And so if we cut back the easy access to guns, less money for the gun manufacturers, less money for the gun lobby, I understand the business of it, but that business is causing blood. And the kids that are dying in Chicago, and for many years nobody even cared about Chicago because the violence is primarily black and brown. The reality is that I don't understand why we can't title guns just like cars. If I have a car and I give it to you, Mr. President, and I don't transfer a title and you're in an accident, it's on me. We don't take cars away by putting titles on them. Why can't we do that with guns? And every gun in America. So if somebody who's buying 200 guns, selling them on the streets, if they can't transfer those titles, then they're going to be held responsible for the guns that they sell.
Well, Father Mike, first of all, for those of you who don't know him, has been working since before I moved to Chicago, and I was a 23-year-old when I first met him. And somehow I aged and he didn't. Which,
your gray hair is not going back. Yeah, I can tell you for answer.
He was always the best-looking priest in Chicago. So, but Father Pfleger's done heroic work at St. Sabina Parish. Issues like licensing, registration, that's an area where there's just not enough national consensus at this stage to even consider it. And part of it is people's concern that that becomes a prelude to taking people's guns away. I mean, part of the challenge in this is that the gun debate gets wrapped up in broader debates about whether the federal government is oppressive, and there are conspiracy theories floating around the internet these days all the time. We did a military exercise in Texas, and a whole bunch of folks were sure that this was the start of martial law, and were suggesting maybe don't cooperate with the United States Army in an effort to prepare so that if they get deployed overseas, they can handle it. But that's how difficult sometimes these debates are. But I want to pick up on some things where I think there should be consensus. One of those areas that I talked about at the speech, part of the proposal, is developing smart gun technology. Now, this is an interesting example. I don't exactly understand this, and maybe there will be somebody in the audience who explains it to me. Back in 1997, the CEO of Colt said, we can design or are starting to develop guns where you can only use it if you've got a chip. So you wear a band or a bracelet, and that then protects your 2-year-old or 3-year-old from picking up the gun and using it. And a boycott was called against them, and they had to back off of developing that technology. The same with Smith & Wesson. They were in the process of developing similar technology, and they were attacked by the NRA as surrendering. Now, to me, this does not make sense. If you are a gun owner, I would think that you would at least want a choice so that if you wanted to purchase a firearm that could only be used by you, in part to avoid accidents in your home, in part to make sure that if it's stolen, it's not used by a criminal, in part if there's an intruder, you pull the gun, but somehow it gets wrested away from you, that gun can't be turned on you and used on you. I would think there might be a market for that. You could sell that gun. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily would be the only gun that's available, but it seems to me that that would be something that in any other area, in any other product, any other commercial venture, there'd be some research and development on that because that's a promising technology. It has not been developed primarily because it's been blocked by either the NRA, which are funded by gun manufacturers, or other reasons. And what we proposed was, you know what, we're going to do some of the research. We'll work with the private sector. We'll figure out whether or not this technology can be developed, and then give everybody a choice in terms of the kind of firearm that they want to purchase, because I think that there will, in fact, be a market for that. And over time, that's an example of how we could reduce some of the preventable gun deaths that are out there.
I want to bring in somebody who actually knows a lot about selling guns. I want you to meet Chris Jacob. He's vice president of the American Firearms Retailers Association. He's the owner of the Bullseye Indoor Shooting Range and Gun Store in San Rafael, California. Chris, it's great to have you here. First of all, how is business under President Obama? Because everything I read says gun sales have been going up. Every time he talks about guns, gun sales go up.
It's been busy. And certainly, I think, shows, as Taya said earlier, that there's a very serious concern in this country about personal security. And the sheriff is right. They do everything they possibly can to make sure they get there as quickly as they possibly can. And my question is actually focused around law enforcement as well. There's 53,000 licensed gun dealers in the United States who stand behind the counter and say no to people all day.
Yep.
We feel it's our responsibility to make sure that people who have a criminal past, people who are mentally ill or are having a bad day don't get possession of firearms. So we assist law enforcement all the time in the process of making sure that those things don't change hands inside our commercial market if they shouldn't. It's a very serious responsibility for us, and as a group, we take it very seriously. My question is around the executive order related to the investigators, the inspectors, the adding of 200 inspectors who are more on the auditing and record-keeping side. Why not add 200 ATF agents on the law enforcement side to keep the criminals and the bad guys out of the stores in the first place? I mean, the problem seems to me to be, you mentioned dealers who are less responsible than others, and certainly it's possible that those folks are out there. But if we can enforce the laws that already exist, the tens of thousands of gun laws that are on the books right now, it might create a very significant deterrent
and Chris,
getting those people in the
stores. Let me also point out the number of ATF agents during your administration has actually declined. So even if you hired 200,
not because of my budget.
But even if you hired 200 more, it'll get it to what it was right before you took office.
Well, look, first of all, there are a whole bunch of responsible gun dealers out there. And my hope would be that those gun dealers would support making sure that everybody's following the same rules that they are. That's number one. Number two is we're not writing a new law. Only Congress can do that. This is about enforcing existing laws and closing what has grown into a massive loophole where a huge percentage of guns, many of whom end up being traced to crime, are not going through the responsible gun dealers, but are going through irresponsible folks who are not registered as doing business. And the whole goal here is to clarify and to put on notice that if you're a business, even if you don't have bricks and mortar, then you're supposed to register and you're supposed to conduct background checks. So the issue is not where you do it, it's what you're doing. And that should not be something that threatens responsible gun dealers across the country. In terms of the ATF, it is absolutely true that the ATF budget has been shrunk. It's a little late, but you knew what I meant. And part of it is because of the politicizing of this issue. So many in the Republican Congress feel as if the ATF is not their friend, but their enemy. Part of the story I was
this issue
telling.
should be politicized, though.
Well, but what I mean by that, Anderson, is that they have been portrayed as trying to take people's guns away, as opposed to trying to make sure that the laws are enforced. And one of the most frustrating things that I hear is when people say, who are opposed to any further laws, why don't you just enforce the laws that are on the books? And those very same members of Congress then cut ATF budgets to make it impossible to enforce the law. And so it is, and by the way, the ATF is a law enforcement agency working under the FBI that is doing enormous work in going after criminals and drug cartels and have a pretty dangerous job. So it's not as if doing background checks or auditing gun sales is all that they're doing. Part of my proposal is also developing better technologies so that we can do tracing of shells when a crime is committed in order to figure out who exactly are the perpetrators of the crime and where did they obtain the weapon. So there's a whole bunch of other elements to this that are going to be important. But my hope is that responsible gun dealers like yourself and your organization are going to be supportive of this proposal, because it should actually help push away unscrupulous dealers, and that means more customers for you guys.
I want to bring in Mark Kelly, as you know, former astronaut, husband of former Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, who we're proud to say is here tonight. 5 years ago this week in Tucson, Arizona, Congresswoman Giffords was shot. 6 others were killed. Captain, your question?
Well, thank you for being here, Mr. President. As you know, Gabby and I are both gun owners. We take gun ownership very seriously and, really think about the voices of responsible gun owners in this debate. But I want to follow up to something Father Pfleger said and your answer to his question, and it's about expanded background checks. Often what you hear in the debate of expanding background checks to more gun sales, and as you know, Gabby and I are 100% behind the concept of somebody getting a background check before buying a gun. But when we testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, we heard not only from the gun lobby, but from United States senators that expanding background checks will, not may, will lead to a registry, which will lead to confiscation, which will lead to a tyrannical government. So I would like you to explain, with 350 million guns in 65 million places, households, from Key West to Alaska, 350 million objects in 65 million places. If the federal government wanted to confiscate those objects, how would they do that?
Well, look, first of all, every time I see Gabby, I'm just so thrilled because I visited her in the hospital. And as I mentioned, I think in the speech in the White House, as we left the hospital then to go to a memorial service, we got word that Gabby had opened her eyes for the first time. And we did not think that she was going to be here, and she is. And Mark's just been extraordinary. And by the way, Mark's twin brother's up in space right now and is breaking the record for the longest continuous orbiting of the planet, which is pretty impressive stuff. What I think Mark is alluding to is what I said earlier, this notion of a conspiracy out there, and it gets wrapped up in concerns about the federal government. Now, there's a long history of that. That's in our DNA. The United States was born suspicious of some distant authority.
But let me just jump in. Is it fair to call it a conspiracy? I mean,
well, yeah.
There's a lot of people really believe this deeply, that they just don't. No. They just don't trust you.
I'm sorry, Cooper. Yes, it is fair to call it a conspiracy. What are you saying? Are you suggesting that the notion that we are creating a plot to take everybody's guns away so that we can impose martial law
but there's certainly a
is
lot of
a
people.
conspiracy? Yes, that is a conspiracy. I would hope that you would agree with that. Is that controversial? Except on some websites around the country?
There are certainly a lot of people who just have a fundamental distrust that you do not want to go further and further and further down this road.
Look, I mean, I'm only going to be here for another year. I don't know. When would I have started on this enterprise, right? I come from the state of Illinois, which we've been talking about Chicago, but downstate Illinois is closer to Kentucky than it is to Chicago. And everybody hunts down there. And a lot of folks own guns. And so this is not like alien territory to me. I've got a lot of friends like Mark who are hunters. I just came back from Alaska where I ate a moose that had just been shot. And it was pretty good. So yes, it is a false notion that I believe is circulated for either political reasons or commercial reasons in order to prevent a coming together among people of goodwill to develop common sense rules that will make us safer while preserving the Second Amendment. And the notion that we can't agree on some things while not agreeing on others, and the reason for that is because, well, the president secretly wants to do X, it would mean that we'd be paralyzed doing everything. I mean, maybe when I propose to make sure that, you know, unsafe drugs are taken off the market, that secretly I'm trying to control the entire drug industry or take people's drugs away, but probably not. What's more likely is I just want to make sure that people are not dying by taking bad drugs.
You wrote an op-ed that just got published.
Yes.
A lot of people probably have not read it yet. One of the things you say in it is that you are not going to campaign for, vote for any candidate, regardless of what party they're in, or if they do not support common sense gun reform.
Yeah, I meant what I said. And the reason, the reason I said that is this. The majority of people in this country are a lot more sensible than what you see in Washington. And the reason that Washington doesn't work well, in part, is because the loudest, shrillest voices, the least compromising, the most powerful, or those with the most money, have the most influence. And the way Washington changes is when people vote. And the way we break the deadlock on this issue is when Congress does not have just a stranglehold on this debate, or excuse me, the NRA does not have a stranglehold on Congress in this debate, but it is balanced by a whole bunch of folks, gun owners, law enforcement, the majority of the American people. When their voices are heard, then things get done. The proposals that we put forward are a version, a lawful, more narrow version of what was proposed by Joe Manchin and Senator Toomey of Pennsylvania, a Republican and a Democrat, both of whom get straight A scores from the NRA. And somehow, after Newtown, that did not pass the Senate. The majority of senators wanted it, but 90% of Republicans voted against it. And I'll be honest with you, 90% of those senators didn't disagree with the proposal, but they were fearful that it was going to affect them during the election. So all I'm saying is that this debate will not change and get balanced out so that lawful gun owners and their Second Amendment rights are protected, but we're also creating a pathway towards a safer set of communities. It's not going to change until those who are concerned about violence are not as focused and disciplined during election time as those who are. And I'm going to throw my shoulders behind folks who want to actually solve problems instead of just getting a high score from an interest group.
We have time for one more question. And we talked about Chicago a little bit. We haven't really heard from young people tonight. No offense to those who have spoken, because I'm in the same category as you all. Sorry, Father. But there's a lot of kids. There's a lot of kids, as you know, growing up in Chicago, fearful of walking to school, fearful of coming home from school.
Yeah.
There's a lot of kids who have been killed on buses. There's a lot of moms of kids who have been killed in the streets of Chicago. And I want you to meet Trey Bosley. He's 18 years old. He's a high school student whose brother Terrell was shot and killed nearly 10 years ago while he was helping a friend in a church parking lot. Terrell would have turned 28 years old on this Tuesday. What's your question, Trey?
Yeah, as you said, I lost my brother a few years ago, well, 10 years ago. And I've also lost a countless amount of family members and friends to gun violence as well. And just speaking on growing up as a young black teen in Chicago, where you're surrounded by not only just gun violence, but police brutality as well. Most of us aren't thinking of our life on a long-term scale. Most of us are either thinking day to day, hour to hour, for some even minute to minute. I want to thank you for your stand against gun violence, for not only the victims of gun violence, but those on the verge of being victims of gun violence. And my question to you is, what is your advice to those youth growing up surrounded by poverty and gun violence?
Well, first of all, Terrell, I couldn't be prouder of you. And I know, is that your mom next to you? I know she's proud of you right now. So good job, Mom. When I see you, Terrell, I think about my own,
Trey.
Trey. When I see you, I think about my own youth. Because I wasn't that different from you. Probably not as articulate and maybe more of a goof off. But the main difference was I lived in a more forgiving environment. If I screwed up, I wasn't at risk of getting shot. I'd get a second chance. There were a bunch of folks who were looking out for me, and there weren't a lot of guns on the streets. And that's how all kids should be growing up, wherever they live. My main advice to you is to continue to be an outstanding role model for the young ones who are coming up behind you. Keep listening to your mom. Work hard and get an education. Understand that high school and whatever peer pressure or restrictions you're under right now won't matter by the time you're a full adult, and what matters is your future. But what I also want to say to you is that you're really important to the future of this country. And I think it is critical in this debate to understand that it's not just inner city kids who are at risk in these situations. Out of the 30,000 deaths due to gun violence, about 2/3 of them are actually suicides. Now, that's part of the reason why we are investing more heavily also in mental health under my proposal. But while the majority of victims of gun homicide are black or Hispanic, the overwhelming majority of suicides by young people are white. And those two are tragedies. Those two are preventable. I'm the father of two outstanding young women, but being teenagers is tough. And, we've all remember, the times where you get confused, you're angry, and then next thing you know, if you have access to a firearm, what kind of bad decisions you might make. So those are deaths we also want to prevent. Accidental shootings are also deaths we want to prevent. And we're not going to prevent all of them. But we can do better. We're not going to, through this initiative alone, solve all the problems of inner city crime. Some of that, as I said, has to do with investing in these communities and making sure there's good education and jobs and opportunity. And great parents and moral responsibility and ethical behavior and instilling that in our kids. That's going to be important. So this is not a proposal to solve every problem. It's a modest way of us getting started on improving the prospects of young men and young women like you, the same way we try to improve every other aspect of our lives. That's all it is. And if we get started, as I said before, it used to be people didn't wear seatbelts, didn't have airbags. It takes 20, 30 years, but you look and then you realize all these amazing lives of young people like this who are contributing to our society because we came together in a practical way, looking at evidence, looking at data, and figured out how can we make that work better. Right now, Congress prohibits us even studying through the Center for Disease Control ways in which we could reduce gun violence. That's how crazy this thing has become. Let's at least figure out what works. And some of the proposals that I'm making may turn out are not as effective as others, but at least let's figure it out. Let's try some things. Let's not just assume that every few weeks there's a mass shooting that gets publicity. Every few months there's one that gets national publicity. Every day there are a whole bunch of folks shot on streets around the country that we don't even hear about. That is not something that we can be satisfied with. And part of my faith and hope in America is just that, not that we achieve a perfect union, but that we get better. And we can do better than we're doing right now, if we come together. So, thank you.
Mr. President, thank you very much for your time.
Appreciate it very much.
I want to thank everybody here who took part, everyone who made this vital conversation possible. President Obama, all our guests, George Mason University, everyone. The conversation continues now with CNN's Jake Tapper. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Really an honor, sir. I wish you the best.
So you're a senior this year?
Good evening, I'm Jake Tapper, and you just watched a remarkable event, a live town hall meeting with President Obama. He spoke with CNN's Anderson Cooper and real people from across the political spectrum about guns and gun violence and gun control. Let's talk about it. I'm joined here in Washington by an all-star group of CNN analysts and experts. You'll also hear reactions from the folks who spoke face-to-face with the president. Let's get some initial reaction from some of our commentators here. Hugh Hewitt, you're a skeptic of President Obama, a skeptic of his proposals. What did you think? Did he convince anyone in that room if he didn't convince you?
No, I'm very disappointed. It was a terrific setting. Anderson Cooper opened with a very tough set of questions about why do you talk about confiscation? Why do you talk about Australia? What's your trust deficit? Anderson closed with tough questions. He got tough questions from Kea. He got tough questions from Kimberly, from Sheriff Paul. He answered none of them. It's not a conspiracy to worry about this president's abuse of power. He put out an unconstitutional executive order about immigration. He unconstitutionally limited Hobby Lobby's rights. It is not a conspiracy to be concerned about where he's going and to mock, minimize, and to denigrate the people whom you ought to be serving is deeply disappointing.
We're watching President Obama as he goes around the room there at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, meeting with a lot of supporters as well as skeptics. There were certainly a number of individuals in the room who came armed with questions that were difficult for the president, people who were gun owners. Jay Carney, former White House press secretary, you worked for the president during some very difficult times.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.